All right, kicking off another episode of Zen and Call Signs. My next guest is Chris Quilty. Came across you quite a few years ago at the Iridium conference in San Diego, and your intelligent macro take on the space industry really elevated my perspective. And then I've in the back of my mind as I was wanting to do this podcast, it was always somebody I wanted to have somebody to chat with who had that idea and background. So, but if you could kick it off. And start from your background of young Chris Quilty, about to graduate from high school, going into that journey there. I'd love for you to start there, and then we'll riff and see how it goes.
Yeah, so didn't come from a military family other than grandparents in World War II, but had a love or a desire to fly. And so actually I got an appointment to the Air Force Academy, but found out my left eye was not quite 20/20. And so made a big shift, figured I didn't want to end up in a missile silo. So went to the Naval Academy, which was a good call, and met my wife there, and graduated in 89, went into the Navy diving and salvage service. Again, because I couldn't fly in the military. I'd spent 5 years in the service, got out, and went to business school, University of Chicago, and decided I want to get into finance. And that brought me down to St. Petersburg, Florida, where Raymond James is headquartered. I joined Raymond James back in 96. And by the early 2000s, I had shifted my area of focus onto the space industry. And that was primarily because I was covering small cap defense companies. And post 9/11, basically every single company I was writing research on got acquired. And so I had to figure out something else to do to stay gainfully employed. And if you know about the space industry in the mid 2000s, most of the industry was bankrupt. In the late 90s, there was a big space bubble that had happened. And famously, Iridium Communications was the largest corporate bankruptcy in history at the time. People kind of forgot about it. There are business cases around the failure of that company, which was building satellite phones. And the market went away for them by the time the constellation was up, and there were inexpensive cellular plans you could get. And the company, which was about a $5 billion investment, was bought for $25 million in bankruptcy. And so I started writing on the industry. There was really nobody on Wall Street that was focusing on the industry. So I did that for 20 years at Raymond James.
What gave you that idea to start writing on it then? Like, what was going on in your mind?
Oh, well, I mean, quite honestly, it's just put yourself in the mind of an analyst working for an investment bank, right? You've got to find something interesting that investors, will want to transact in. I had to look around the research department. I knew the telecom analyst wasn't interested in it. I was the primary defense analyst. It was a technology that I was familiar with. It's a capital intensive industry. So the bankers have work they can do in terms of raising capital and buying and selling companies. There wasn't anything strategic. Like, I didn't know that Elon Musk was going to change the world. That has sort of worked to my benefit and changed the entire arc of the industry. But simply the fact that I've been doing this for over 25 years now, I have the perspective of what was, back in the, it took 55 years from Sputnik to get 1,000 satellites on orbit. And SpaceX is launching 2,000 of their Starlink satellites a year. So that's where we've come. But, I think at the time, the space industry, as it is today, is still dominated by government, defense, military, intelligence customers. There are large swaths of the industry that are commercial. And I do think that in the next 10 to 20 years, we are going to see a shift, of the kind of I thought as a kid, on the tail end of the 1970s, space euphoria and putting man on the moon. I mean, I think if you look at the TV shows and sci-fi of the era, I mean, I guess we should all be living on a moon base with a robot serving us a cold glass of Tang by now, but that clearly didn't happen. And I think with both the technology and, importantly for me, the economic forces, right? The fact that there are business cases that close commercially today. Is it asteroid mining? I can't tell you. I haven't looked at the numbers on it, but there are a tremendous number of space-related activities. There's 4 private space stations being built. There's 100 missions going to the moon. There was just a company funded to mine helium-3 on the moon. There are companies that have manufactured pharmaceuticals and fiber optic cable in space and brought them back for sale. I mean, this stuff it's starting to happen. Still early days, but I think there's a very different era ahead. And, just a note, I mean, not only is the US government focused on space because of the China threat, and to be clear, China in many ways is surpassing the US. I mean, they've got a lander, running around on the moon, south side of the moon, claiming very valuable resources. That's certainly a big motivator for the industry, but you also have, I don't know if the 2 richest men in the world, in Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, that aren't simply investing in space. They are literally spending their personal wealth to make humanity a multiplanetary species. So that's a pretty good tailwind.
Yeah, agreed. So your background in space seems, well, not space, but you're kind of getting into that. It was more of like luck, or that's kind of what drew you, or are you a sci-fi guy? I'm just curious if anything because I'm a sci-fi guy, and that certainly helps me just like believe and love that stuff. So what about yourself?
Yeah, so, went to the Naval Academy, so I had a technical background, which is basically a good bullshit meter. Like if it comes to real math, technical spectrum issues and whatnot, I need help.
Sure.
But so I had that sort of technical background. I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to fly. I did not grow up knowing the names of all the NASA astronauts and, the Mercury astronauts and whatnot. That just wasn't me. I sort of fell into, and fairly enough, fell in love with the industry over the course of time, having just learn so many of the stories, the histories, the people, the evolution, and that's all we do. I mean, at my firm today, when I left Raymond James, I left to form my own little boutique. We're 9 people now, and all we do is financial research on the satellite and space industry. And so I sort of live and breathe that. That's my my reading, my books. And again, I mean, a lot of this stuff is very technical. When I started looking at the industry, I just went out on Amazon and bought a book on rocketry and engines and learned the basic technology. And that's, unfortunately, there's certain schools in the country that are creating sort of space related programs, and certainly a lot of aerospace, but so much of this is just learning on the job.
Yeah, I can imagine. What would you say is Elon has obviously made his style of doing things, obviously having the rocket company to then put your own satellites in space. How has he reshaped or changed the paradigm for, the satellite and space industry?
Yeah, so it obviously started with launch. Launch was the first sleeve of the SpaceX revenue model. And, if you know the long history of how SpaceX got started, I mean, Elon wanted to build a little greenhouse, fly it to Mars, put it on Mars with a camera, and sort of show and inspire the world, this possibility for life on Mars. But, when he tried to find somebody that could launch it, there were no U.S. launch providers. He couldn't get ULA to pay attention to him. Actually went over to Russia and tried to get a decommissioned ICBM, got frustrated with that because the Russians wouldn't sell it to him. So he started his own launch company. And again, self-taught himself everything about the launch industry. And I guess what's important to understand about SpaceX and what they've done in launch is they've basically lowered the cost or the cost of access to orbit by an order of magnitude. Historically, you'd pay about $10,000 to $15,000, $10,000 to $20,000 per kilogram to get something into orbit. I think the list price of a Falcon 9 is now around $2,000 a kilogram. A Falcon Heavy is $1,200 a kilogram. And then when the Starship, which did that pretty incredible demo the other day, that'll be down in the hundreds of dollars, per kilogram, or $50 per kilogram.
Incredible.
And quite simply, when you change the economics of that, I mean, the economics of mining an asteroid, the single biggest cost is going to be the launch. And so when you take it down two orders of magnitude, suddenly the business model closes. But here's the interesting thing is, how did he lower it by an order of magnitude? And it's not the fact that SpaceX developed some new warp drive engine. I mean, they're using the exact same kerosene liquid oxygen technology that's been used for 50 years. And really what they did were 3 things. Number one, was they took out costs, right? They found, what is the biggest cost, and it's expendability, right? I mean, when you throw away the engines and all the staging, he had to figure out how to do reusability. Now, the point is, Elon did not invent it. SpaceX did not invent it. Like, NASA had done demos from the Delta Clipper program going back into the 90s that had demonstrated it. It's simply the fact that the existing incumbents, and there were three entities in the world, the Europeans through Arianespace, the Russians through Roscosmos, and the US with United Launch Alliance, they chose not to implement it. And when you're an oligopoly, I mean, why would you? Right? Your motivation is to collude and raise prices, and that's what happened over
time.
You have
no competition.
No competition. Yeah. Now, the difference is for Elon, I mean, he wasn't trying to simply cut costs 10% or whatnot. He had to lower by orders of magnitude to achieve his goal, and his goal is to build a colony on Mars. That's the starting point for everything. When you try to find the motivation, like, why are they doing Starlink? Not because there was a motivation to connect the unconnected. Well, it's cash, right? And we've done a deep dive on the model. I mean, even though they're launching 2,000 satellites a year, they're generating free cash flow from this business. And, space is only a $7 billion a year industry. It's not big enough to fund a Mars colony, which is why they branched out into Starlink. It was an adjacency that they could address, and it's a $1 trillion addressable market that they are now tapping into. So back to how did they lower launch costs? Number one is they introduced reusability, right? They achieved scale that nobody else in the industry, they're now targeting, 150 launches a year. The Cape had never launched more than 29 times a year, going back to the 1960s. They're targeting close to 100 out of the Cape this year. So the scale is certainly, an important element to it, the reusability. And finally, I think they have, by branching out into Starlink, they created the scale demand to drive down costs on the launch price. And with Starship, that is not a partially reusable like the Falcon 9, because the Falcon 9, you're throwing away the second stage every time. With Starship, the entire rocket is reusable, and the entire rocket was designed to be used multiple times a day, which is crazy.
Incredible. Yeah. It's like stuff of sci-fi. And I think to me, it's like the stuff of like, hey, when like you're backed into a corner and you just do like persistency, you don't give up, and you just like, I'm going to make it happen. And because I look at like NASA, and they spend like $63 million a day. That's their just every day on our average for the last 50 years. And you're like, what's up, guys? Like, how's this guy who just figured it all out himself and did it all, not by himself, hired some smart people, but just like, how did that seems crazy to me. Like, what's your thought on that? You kind of going back to the oligopoly.
So remember NASA, so NASA, as a government organization, it's interesting when you see the public surveys, they always rank number one, right, in public perception. And there's certainly a lot of good things that happen out of NASA, but remember, they're a politically driven organization. So whoever the NASA administrator is, whatever the administration's goals are, or the direction that they have to hew, I give them a lot of credit. NASA, even before the DoD, has really jumped on this commercial trend. And so you can go back to the Bush administration and the Obama administration when they began both the commercial cargo and commercial crew programs. And this is, when the shuttle went away and NASA no longer had a way to get cargo up there, they hired commercial companies. And it was Northrop Grumman and SpaceX to do the cargo. It was SpaceX and Boeing, to do the crew. But they've also got commercial programs. There's one called CLPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services. So instead of NASA building rockets and landers to get there, they're just paying a fixed price contract. They tend to be around $100 million for commercial companies to take a payload to the moon. And NASA says, look, I don't care how you get it there, right? I'm just paying you for a service to transport this rover, this instrument, to the Earth's surface. And the fact that they're seeding these commercial orders has created an entire industry. In fact, you've got two companies, one from Japan, iSpace, and one in the US, Intuitive Machines, that have basically been able to go public and raise huge amounts of capital based upon this NASA contract. So NASA does good things, but then NASA does bad things. And I'll say that the biggest bad thing is not their fault, not the Artemis program, which I think is a great concept of coalition building and setting rules of the road, but the SLS rocket and the Orion capsule, these are national disgraces. They were never asked for by NASA. NASA never had a plan for them. When the shuttle program was shutting down in 2010, the appropriators in Colorado and Texas and Florida wrote into the FY10 appropriations bill, you will build a rocket with a 100-ton lift capacity that uses the engines from the shuttle, that uses the boosters from the shuttle, that uses the avionics from the shuttle. So it was a jobs program, right, to keep all those people employed. The rocket itself cost $4 billion to launch, and it has less capability, than the Starship, right? And it's a expendable rocket using reusable engines from the shuttle. I mean, it's a stupid idea from beginning to end. And I think there is, even people that are involved in the program, will quietly tell you, this is a dumb idea, right? And who knows, we may see with the election, I think there's a potential for that program to be rationalized. I would hope so. But it's so expensive. It's basically 1/6 of NASA's budget to launch a freaking rocket. That's $4 billion. That's a Ford class aircraft carrier. And you can buy a Falcon Heavy, which launches half as much for $100 million. So NASA, they are straddled with certain things that they are required to do. I think the good news is, if you see, a program like SLS and Orion getting canceled, you've now got billions of dollars that can flow back into the things that NASA should be doing, which is the science and planetary stuff for which there is not a commercial rationale. That's what the government and NASA should be focusing on.
Interesting. I don't know, but does any candidate have a kind of a plan? I mean, I know that Donald Trump created Space Force, but I don't know what that means. I don't know if a lot of people understand what that, but has any candidate ever been, or Republican or Democrat, been a better proponent of space and opening up that market?
Yeah. So I can't help, but I'm going to piss people off. But what I'm saying is the truth, right? The Trump administration, whether you like them or not, was the most impactful administration for the space industry in 50 years. And you can't dispute that. I think in most elections, space, people in the industry get excited if the word space shows up in a presidential speech, in a candidate speech, and that's about all you'll get is maybe a mention. But for most, it is pretty much an afterthought. And it doesn't drive a ton of votes, right? So understandably, for reasons I cannot explain to this day, other than perhaps, the role of Mike Pence, who was a known, space geek, like a guy who was really into space. The Trump administration, they created the Space Force, right, out of whole cloth. I mean, that concept really wasn't even being pushed tremendously by the industry. You have the reestablishment of the National Space Council, the Artemis program, funding went up. And so there was a tremendous amount of activity. And of course, Trump, during his first administration, set the goal of returning, an American to the moon by the end of his second administration. So he had a 4-year gap, but there's a possibility
may hit it. Maybe
he may reestablish that goal, which, NASA with the Artemis program does have a fairly stretched out goal of getting there. But unfortunately, it's on this SLS rocket that is a trip to nowhere, I believe.
Yeah. What's kind of the most interesting project, maybe use case that, either has taken place in the past 5 years or is in process for space, maybe looking back to Earth or somewhere else, anything? What do you have? What do you think? What comes to mind?
Yeah. So what I'll say is there's a lot of interesting things happening in what we call the cislunar space environment.
Yep.
So this is kind of everything from, low Earth orbit out to the moon. These are activities where, the revenue producing activity is in space for space. So in space manufacturing, there's companies building orbital depots for fuel, refueling and service activity for satellites. All that stuff is really cool from a tech perspective. But undoubtedly, the most impactful thing that SpaceX has done is Starlink. Starlink is changing the face of the industry changing the face of satellite communications and possibly doing something that no satellite communications provider has ever done, which is to actually compete directly with terrestrial and win. Satellite communications has always been the option of last resort. If you can't get DSL or cable or fiber or a fixed wireless, then I guess we'll have to go with satellite because it was a poor substitute. Low data rates, latency. Starlink is up there competing with a home cable service, and the system has some very unique attributes and benefits, of being a global system that is cross-linked with lasers in space, has tremendous amount.
That's taking place now. Is that the cross-link? I didn't know if that was the standard now or was going to be. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so historically all satellites operated from what's called a geostationary orbit. So they're 36,000 kilometers away from the Earth, and they spin, they go around the Earth at the exact same rate that the Earth is turning. So it looks like it's in the same place in the sky. And that's why, when you get a direct TV, the technician can come out to your house, put a little parabolic dish on your roof, aim it, and walk away because the satellite is always overhead. Starlink is different, right? I'm sure you've seen. It is a constellation of thousands of satellites that are only flying, around 500 and 600 kilometers above. So each satellite individually, from where you're standing, will fly overhead for like 6 to 8 minutes and then pass by. That doesn't work great for, a Wi-Fi service or a phone call if you only had 6 to 8 minutes, which is why you have to stack these things one behind another. And you can look, at any Google search, Starlink, and you'll see these graphics of this big mesh of satellites around the Earth. So the problem with that is when you're 36,000 kilometers away, you can see a ground station on 40% of the Earth's surface, right? If the satellite is sitting over North America, you could literally put the ground station in Africa and still see it. With a satellite that's only 500 kilometers up, it can't see much of the ground. And so if you needed the ground station to relay all of your traffic, you'd be out of luck. So the method that they use is to instead connect the satellites to each other in space, a big mesh network, and you transfer all the data from satellite to satellite until it gets over a ground station where it can download. Now, the only other satellite constellation that uses this cross-linking concept is Iridium, which we mentioned before, that went bankrupt in the 1990s. It's a $5 or $6 billion market cap company today. They've come back, rebuilt their business, and their system, because it was designed for satellite phones, had the same or needed the same cross-linking capability. Now they were able, because a phone call, or for their narrowband Internet of Things service, you don't need a lot of bandwidth. So they were able to just do it using traditional sort of radio frequency connections. The problem is with Starlink, they're trying to deliver 100, 200 megabits per second, a gigabit per second to end customers. You can't use, a 1 megabit per second radio crosslink between the satellites. You got to figure out, how can I move a ton of data between two satellites? And the answer is lasers. Now,
nice.
The problem is, so this is a core technology. It's not like optional. Either you're going to build, and Elon had talked about it. He's like, if we can't figure out crosslinks, we're going to have to run a fiber optic cable to a ship in the middle of the ocean and build a little tower so we can download, or you can't communicate over the ocean. So it's a critical technology, and yet prior to 10 years ago, there had only been a couple dozen of these laser terminals that had been built and flown. The company who is the leader in the market, an Airbus subsidiary called TSAT, their terminal weighed 50 kilograms and cost, I'm guessing, like $30 million. Now remember, the satellites are only 800 kilograms, the Starlink satellite, so you can't throw 100 kilograms, 200 kilograms if you put four of these things on, the power, the cost. So what SpaceX and Amazon and, the other terminal developers are trying to do is to evolve this from a 50 kilogram device to a 5 kilogram, and from 30 million bucks to 50,000. So that's a lot of orders of magnitude that they've had to improve it. And it's not a totally fair comparison because I was talking about a GEO terminal versus a LEO terminal. But there's been a tremendous amount of development in this area SpaceX is currently the only constellation that is using those optical crosslinks. However, we also have the Space Development Agency, which is the procurement arm, one of the procurement arms of the newly formed Space Force. SDA is building a constellation of, let's call it 400 to 500 military-owned, military-operated satellites that will be, their proliferated constellation used for transporting communications, tracking, missile tracking. It has multiple different layers and capabilities. The SDA has also decided that they are going to use these optical terminals as the standard. And they have created an entire industry of a dozen and a half companies that are building these terminals. Now, there's one problem, right? SDA and the entire industry have set on one standard. SpaceX has their own standard. And Amazon will probably have their own standard. So there is an issue of compatibility. SpaceX is the 800-pound gorilla in terms of the number of terminals, and they've actually announced for the first time ever that they are going to sell a component, their terminal, on a merchant basis to the industry. And the motivation here is obvious, right? I mean, if everybody has a SpaceX terminal on their satellite, well, then you'll pay SpaceX to backhaul your traffic over the Starlink constellation. So yeah, the optical crosslinks are an important technology, still developing, still being proliferated, and the other important technology for that LEO broadband constellation is the user terminal. As we mentioned before, for DirecTV, it's a little metal stamp dish, right, that you put up on your roof.
Yeah, we have a Starlink in my family in the mountains. Exactly. Yeah, we already been using it.
So what's different about that terminal is that is an electronically steered antenna array, and it creates digital beams that track the satellites. You can't use a traditional mechanical dish to track those satellites. So, the bottom line is they had to develop a consumer grade, low cost, flat panel antenna. And the problem is, just like with the optical terminals, the state of the art at the time, flat panel antennas were primarily a military technology. Multi-million-dollar systems used on Navy ships or Air Force aircraft for tracking enemy tracking and missile deployment and whatnot. So again, they need to take that military-grade technology and work it down to a $500, $600 consumer product. And we've seen, huge strides again in moving that technology forward.
SpaceX seems like they have the capability. I think he wants to put up 12,000 satellites, I think, somewhere on there, maybe more. When that gets implemented and that the data gets, and then they find that super cheap, lightweight laser to facilitate that data being transferred rather than going down to the ground station and then going fiber optic cable. So it seems like it's going to happen. He keeps getting it right. So where do you see that in 5-10 years? Do you think it'll eclipse basically all terrestrial data and satellites? Like if he stays on this similar SpaceX and Starlink on this similar trajectory?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, so what's interesting now is geo satellites have been the way to deliver satellite communications for 50 years. And you have entire industries, whether it's a terrestrial, in land applications. This is how you hook up if you have 1,000 gas stations, right? You can put a satellite dish and network them all together. There's core markets like aviation, which can only be served by satellite. Maritime, same thing. The difference is right now you're seeing SpaceX gut a lot of the industry. If I look at the maritime industry, we've seen service providers that were using GEO that have lost, just in the past year, a quarter of their customers have dropped their GEO service and switched over to Starlink. You saw just last month, in fact, for the first time, a major airline in United Airlines that selected Starlink to provide the internet connectivity on their planes, whereas that had always been, a GEO type service. And I guess the thing is, right now, Starlink has, call it 6,000 satellites on orbit. They've launched them with the world's cheapest launch in the Falcon 9, but not nearly as cheap as it will be, once Starship comes online. And, their current satellites, what they call their Gen 2 Mini, have about 90 gigabits per second. The Gen 3 that will be launched on Starship will have 10 times the throughput. So I guess the point being is, if today SpaceX is already, beating the competition with a Falcon 9 and a Gen 2 Mini, I don't know how to measure what that means once they block upgrade to sort of Gen 3 Starship business model. They're competing and winning a lot of the traditional satellite business, but we're also seeing them starting to nudge into some terrestrial, call it terrestrial telecom type applications and customers. And this is with 6,000 satellites on orbit. I think the actual filing is for 30,000, but they've been approved for 7,500. The only company aside from the Chinese that's close to that is Amazon, which is building around 3,200 satellites. Not that they can't potentially upgrade, but they really are setting themselves up into a class of their own.
This question on Globalstar, because they're tied in, I think, with the iPhone 14 and up.
Yep.
I don't know if they made some black magic chip to gain that satellite functionality, but it's pretty incredibly impressive. So if you could maybe give your thoughts on that.
So as I mentioned before, Starlink is the most impactful thing impacting the space industry today.
Sure.
It impacts the traditional players, it impacts defense, it impacts things globally. But the other technology, similar communication technology that's really taken off in the last couple of years, is this drive towards what the industry calls direct to device. And the idea is today, everything that is satellite communications related, you have to have a SATCOM specific device, a satellite phone, a satellite modem, and it's all done over satellite spectrum. The idea of direct to device is either one of two things. Either we can put a satellite chip into every phone, and that would allow existing satellites to communicate with your phone, or in some cases, SpaceX and another key company, AST Space Mobile, are simply using the carrier spectrum. So AST is using the spectrum from Verizon and AT&T and Vodafone, and they're transmitting it from space to your phone. So you don't have to modify your phone. Like as it exists today, It will work with these new systems. And what's exciting about that is the purpose of that system is to fill in all the dead zones in the world. So as AST and SpaceX build out this capability, well, for better, or I can argue worse, you will never be able to say, I wasn't connected, because this will work in the deserts, it will work in the oceans, it will work in the urban dead zone where you could not get communications. And Globalstar, working with Apple, was the first to roll out this sort of direct-to-device service. It is a bit of a kludge in that the Globalstar satellites were never designed for this, and the service is, it's poor, but if you need to get an SOS signal out, it works, so people can see the value in that. The new systems that are coming online will have 4G, 5G like capability. So, you can be, in the Grand Canyon in a dead zone, you can take a selfie and upload it to Instagram. So I guess marching society forward with the ability to Instagram anywhere. But obviously there's a lot of other more useful cases for it that I can think of. But those services are rolling out over the next several years, and they'll just be part of your regular carrier plan.
Well, let's end it. Again, last question, or kind of turn it over to you, and then when you answer, please kind of tell everybody where they can find you. Of like, if you have some predictions, just this is obviously opinions of what's happening next. 5, 10. I think you maybe covered it to some degree, but it's like if Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos get together, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, whatever it is, but some audacious prediction or something interesting to kind of finish off. What do you got? Because I feel like you have some degree of an inside track.
So I could give a different answer after next Tuesday.
All right.
As I said, I think it could be impactful. But if I just take the broader strokes of, where things are going in the next 10 to 15 years, I do think that sort of cislunar economy, and it sounds like crazy stuff, right? But, bottom line is, if it's commercially feasible, like if I can manufacture pharmaceuticals cheaper and better in space than I can on Earth, then that is an activity that will happen. So I think generically, and there's not a big
Yeah.
splashy element to it, you will see the number of companies and the number of activities that are space related begin to get normalized in a way. Well, honestly, all the space services we use, I mean, GPS, people just take it for granted. God help
Right.
me, like if it went down, my kids don't know how to use a map. They would all be stuck wherever the hell they are at that point in time.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of space services that are, we use on a daily basis. Every time you go to swipe your credit card at a gas station, it's happening over satellite. So
Yeah.
um, the types of things, however, that we are going to be doing in the future, I think will have a much better ability to sort of grab the public's awareness and excitement. And I do think, God, I wish. Apparently, when the federal government has a logo or something, they can't license it. So I had thought one of the coolest ways to figure out enthusiasm for NASA was to count up the number of licensing dollars for NASA t-shirts. Pay attention,
Hmm.
right? I find all the time, no matter where I go in the world, people wearing NASA t-shirts. And I don't remember that 10 or 15 years ago. And I think it's a pretty good indication that, the general public is hearing these things about building a Mars colony. And, Elon just announced his latest effort to bring people to Mars in a couple of years. I think as the general public becomes more aware and more aware of the benefits of what's happening in space, because oftentimes people just think of it as crazy science expenses, I think you'll see a pretty big orientation to go ahead and capitalize on the economic benefits of what space offers.
Cool. All right. Well, that's about it for us. Thank you for being here. If you could kind of maybe recap on where everybody could find your information and where you play on social media.
Yeah, so Quilty Space is the name of the company, and quiltyspace.com. We have research on there. We publish sort of quick take news items and other content. You can sign up for a newsletter we'll send out every couple weeks that'll highlight things that we've published and news in the industry. We are on Twitter and LinkedIn, of course, and you can reach me by emailing me directly at chrisq@quiltyspace.com.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, sir, for your time. It was a pleasure. Thank you for being on.
All right, thank you.